The wind cut across the plains with a sharpness that felt almost personal, like the land itself was testing the will of those who dared to survive on it. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the thin fabric did little to protect against the chill. Beside her, her daughter Emily clutched her small hand, stumbling to keep pace. The child's cheeks were pale, her lips pressed tightly together as if she were fighting not to cry. Clara's heart clenched. Emily had been so strong these past weeks, never once complaining despite the hardships that pressed down on them both. They had been on the road for days, moving from settlement to settlement, always searching for a place to stop, to belong. Her husband had died months earlier, taken swiftly by fever during the long winter. His passing left Clara not only widowed, but also adrift, with no kin to turn to and no money to her name. She sold what little she could, bartered for food, and carried Emily with her as she trudged westward. Each town brought new hope, and each town seemed to shut its doors just as quickly. That morning, Clara had tried the general store in this small town, her voice trembling as she asked the keeper if he might spare her a little flour in exchange for mending or washing. The man's eyes had hardened the moment he saw her worn dress and Emily's thin face. He shook his head sharply, muttering something about "no handouts here," before turning his back. Clara's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she swallowed her pride. There was no room for anger when a child's stomach ached with hunger. The boarding house was no kinder. The keeper's wife eyed her skeptically, arms crossed over her chest. "Rooms are for paying folk," she said flatly, as though Clara's very presence soiled the floorboards. She offered no pity when Clara explained she had money enough for one night, but nowhere to go after that. "Better move along before you get too settled," the woman said, closing the door with a thud that echoed in Clara's chest. By evening, Clara found herself sitting on the edge of the dusty main street, Emily curled against her side, her small body shivering as the last of the sun sank behind the hills. The sound of laughter drifted from the saloon, mingling with the rhythmic clop of horses' hooves. The world moved on around her, but for Clara, time seemed suspended in a haze of despair. She brushed Emily's hair back from her forehead, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. "We'll find a place soon, darling. I promise." Emily's eyes, wide and trusting, looked up at her with the kind of faith only a child could hold. That faith was both a balm and a burden. Clara had to find a way, because her daughter deserved more than hunger and cold nights. As the air grew sharper, Clara wondered how many more nights like this they could endure. She thought of her late husband and the home they once shared, simple though it was. The empty chair by the fire, the silence at night, those memories weighed heavily, but none so much as the image of Emily's gaunt little face. A roof, a warm bed, a safe place to call home. Those were luxuries Clara no longer dreamed for herself. They were necessities she ached to give her child. When Emily coughed softly in her sleep, Clara's resolve hardened. She would not let her daughter fade in the cold. Somewhere someone would see them not as a burden, but as souls worth saving. Somewhere there had to be mercy left in the world, and though she could not know it yet, the man who would change both their lives was closer than she realized, watching quietly from the shadow of his horse, his weathered face thoughtful as he took in the sight of a mother and child alone on the edge of hope. Samuel Hart had always been a man of few words. Folks in town knew him as steady, hard-working, and quiet as the hills. He rarely lingered when he came in for supplies, just purchased what he needed, tipped his hat, and rode back to his ranch. Some mistook his silence for coldness, but those who paid closer attention understood it came from grief more than pride. His wife had passed 3 years ago, leaving him with their daughter Mary and a house that felt far too empty for 2 souls. That afternoon, Samuel had ridden into town for a few tools and feed. He tied his horse outside the general store and noticed, almost at once, the woman standing near the door. She was thin, but carried herself with a certain dignity, her chin lifted despite the weariness in her eyes. A little girl clung to her skirts, looking pale and tired, her small hands gripping tightly as if afraid her mother might slip away. Samuel slowed, leaning casually against the hitching post. though his gaze lingered on them longer than it should. He watched as the widow. He guessed she was one. From the black trim on her dress and the absence of a man at her side, spoke to the storekeeper. Her voice was low, but he caught enough to know she was asking for food or work. The keeper shook his head, his mouth a hard line. Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd seen that look before, the kind that turned away a person not because they were unworthy, but because helping meant inconvenience. The woman left with her daughter, her face pale but composed. Samuel thought she might try the boarding house, and sure enough he saw her knock at the door a few minutes later. He stayed where he was, pretending to check his saddle straps while keeping an eye on her. The keeper's wife spoke to her briefly, then shut the door without a shred of sympathy. The woman stood still for a moment as though the weight of that rejection pressed down on her shoulders. Then she turned and guided her daughter toward the edge of town. Something in that small, weary figure stirred Samuel's heart. It wasn't just pity, though he felt the sharp sting of it. It was recognition. He knew what it was to walk through days with a hollow inside, to keep going only because someone smaller and weaker depended on you. He'd lived that after his wife passed, when little Mary cried at night for her mother, and he had no words to ease her sorrow. Samuel had learned then that silence could carry more weight than words. He had simply held his daughter until her sobs faded, doing the best he could with the broken pieces of their lives. But in that woman's face he saw a strength that mirrored his own, a determination to endure, to keep walking forward no matter the hardship. As dusk fell, Samuel noticed her sitting with her daughter on a wooden crate near the road, the child curled against her. The mother's hand stroked the girl's hair, her eyes far away, filled with both fear and stubborn resolve. Samuel shifted uneasily. He had come to town for tools, but now he found himself considering something he hadn't in years, offering more than a passing kindness. Mary needed a mother. That truth gnawed at him each night when he tucked her into bed, her eyes searching his face for a comfort he couldn't always provide. And here was a woman whose child needed a roof, warmth, and security. It was as if Providence itself had placed them in his path. Samuel stayed in the shadows a while longer, measuring the thought. He was not a man who acted rashly, but as the evening deepened and the woman shivered against the cold, he knew his decision had already been made. Quietly, he resolved to step forward, to speak words heavier than any he had spoken in years. The rancher, who so often chose silence, would soon offer the widow both a roof and a place in his home. The lamps in town had begun to glow, their warm flicker spilling across the dirt road as night settled in. Clara pulled Emily closer, wrapping her shawl tightly around them both. She tried to look strong for her daughter's sake, though inside she felt her resolve crumbling. The cold would seep in soon, and she had nowhere to go. Perhaps, she thought with dread, they would have to sleep in the livery stable again, huddled near the smell of hay and horses. It was then she heard the slow, steady sound of boots on the wooden walkway. She looked up and saw a tall man in a weathered coat and broad hat standing a few paces away. His face was rugged, sun-browned, with lines etched deep from years under the open sky. He wasn't a stranger exactly. She had seen him earlier near the general store, leaning by his horse, watching quietly. Now he stood before her, removing his hat with a respectful nod. "Evening." "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep but measured, carrying the quiet authority of someone who didn't speak unless he meant it. Clara tensed, her first instinct to draw Emily closer. The world had not given her much reason to trust men since her husband's passing. But there was nothing threatening in his stance, only a steady calm, as if he had already thought through whatever words he was about to say. "You've no place to stay," he said simply, more a statement than a question. Clara swallowed, uncertain how to reply. "We'll manage," she answered softly, though the words rang hollow. The man studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving from her weary face to the sleeping child nestled at her side. Then he drew in a breath as though steadying himself. "My name's Samuel Hart. I've got a ranch a few miles out. It's too much house for just me and my little girl." His voice lowered, carrying a gentleness that surprised her. "Your daughter needs a roof. My daughter needs a mother." The words landed with such weight that Clara's breath caught. For a moment, she thought she must have misheard him, that the cold and weariness had made her imagine it. But Samuel stood solid, his eyes steady, as if he had laid a piece of his heart bare. Her first instinct was disbelief. "Sir, I don't even know you," she whispered. Samuel nodded once, slow and sure. "Fair enough. You don't owe me trust right off, but I've seen enough tonight to know your girl shouldn't spend another night without a bed. I've got room. You're welcome to it." He paused, his hands tightening slightly on his hat. "You'd be doing as much for me as I'd be doing for you." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to believe in his sincerity, but life had taught her caution. Too often, offers came with hidden costs. Yet as she searched his face, she found no trace of mockery or selfish intent. His eyes, dark, steady, and marked by loss of their own, held only honesty. Still, hesitation warred with desperation. Emily stirred in her sleep, shivering despite the shawl. Clara looked down at her child's fragile form, then back up at the rancher. Could she gamble her daughter's safety on a stranger? Or was this the very mercy she had prayed for? Samuel seemed to sense her turmoil. "Don't decide now if it's more than you can carry. But come tonight. Get her warm, get her fed. After that, you can choose what comes next." The simplicity of his offer, without pressure, eased something inside her. It was not a demand, not even a bargain, only an open door. Clara's eyes stung with tears she hadn't meant to shed. With a shaky nod, she whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Hart." He placed his hat back on his head, his voice quiet. "Samuel will do." Then with a gesture toward his horse, he added, "Come on, ma'am. Let's get you both home." As Clara rose, gathering Emily in her arms, a fragile spark of hope flickered within her. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, for the first time in weeks, her daughter would sleep under a safe roof, and perhaps, though, she hardly dared believe it, this rancher's offer might be the beginning of something more than just shelter. The ride to Samuel's ranch was quiet, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the faint jingle of the horse's bridle. Clara sat side saddle behind him, Emily bundled tightly in her arms. The girl's head rested against her mother's shoulder, her breathing uneven from exhaustion. The rhythm of the horse lulled her quickly into sleep. Clara, though, could not rest. Every clop of the hooves reminded her that she was placing her trust and her daughter's life in the hands of a man she had only just met. The night air was sharp, carrying the scent of sage and earth. Above them, stars stretched endlessly, cold and brilliant. Clara had grown used to feeling small beneath such skies, but tonight, with Samuel's tall frame steady before her and his horse's sure-footed gait beneath, she felt a curious mix of fear and relief. When the ranch house came into view, Clara drew in a breath. It wasn't grand, but it was solid, a two-story structure with a wide porch and a lantern glowing faintly in the window. The barn stood to the side, dark and sturdy, and the faint outlines of corrals stretched beyond. It looked like permanence, like roots sunk deep into the soil, and that sight alone nearly brought tears to her eyes. Samuel dismounted easily and turned to help her down. His hand was warm, calloused, but steady as he guided her and Emily to the ground. He gave no unnecessary words, only a nod toward the door. "Come inside. You'll both be warmer there." The interior of the house was plain but welcoming. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the wooden floors and simple furnishings. Clara's eyes swept the room quickly. A sturdy table, a rocker by the fire, shelves lined with worn books and a few carved toys. It wasn't wealth, but it was home. Her heart clenched at the thought. Samuel set another log on the fire, coaxing the flames higher. "Sit," he said gently, motioning toward the chair near the warmth. Clara obeyed, settling Emily onto her lap. The heat from the fire touched her chilled skin, and for the first time in days, she exhaled without the weight of fear pressing against her lungs. Moments later, light footsteps pattered on the stairs. A small girl, no older than 6, peeked shyly from behind the banister. She had Samuel's dark eyes, but where his gaze was steady and solemn, hers brimmed with curiosity. She clutched a rag doll in one hand, the other thumb tucked halfway to her mouth before she caught herself and lowered it. "Mary," Samuel said softly, his voice gentler than Clara had yet heard it. "This is Mrs.?" He trailed off, leaving Clara space to speak her name. "Clara," she supplied quietly, "and this is my daughter, Emily." Mary's eyes flicked to the sleeping girl, then back to Clara. She gave a quick nod before shuffling closer, still cautious. Clara smiled, trying to ease the child's shyness. "Hello, Mary. Your home is very lovely." Mary's lips curved in a small smile at the compliment, and she leaned against her father's leg. Samuel rested a hand briefly on her hair, an absent but tender gesture. Supper was simple: fresh bread, beans, and a bit of salted pork. Samuel set the table without fuss, moving with the practiced ease of a man used to managing on his own. Clara insisted on helping, but he only said, "Not tonight. Rest. You've had enough for one day." After the meal, Samuel showed Clara to a small bedroom upstairs. The quilt on the bed was worn but carefully mended, the sheets smelling faintly of lavender. Clara laid Emily down, brushing the child's hair back from her forehead as she sank into sleep with a sigh of contentment. Standing in the doorway, Samuel gave her a single nod. "You're safe here," he said simply, then turned away. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, the words echoing in her heart. For the first time in months, she believed them. Safe. The fire downstairs crackled softly. The house sturdy around her, and her daughter slept peacefully. That night, Clara closed her eyes with a prayer of gratitude she hadn't dared whisper aloud in weeks. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight her child had a roof overhead, warmth around her, and perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of a new life. The days that followed were a quiet adjustment, a slow weaving of two separate lives under one roof. Clara woke early, as she always had, to tend to Emily. But in Samuel's house, she found herself listening to the rhythm of another household, the scrape of boots by the door at dawn, the creak of the barn door as he began his chores, the soft patter of Mary's feet on the stairs when she woke to find her father already gone to the fields. On the first morning, Clara stood uncertain in the kitchen. She had not been asked to work, yet her hands itched to be useful. She found flour in the bin, bacon in the larder, and within an hour had a modest breakfast ready: biscuits, eggs, and coffee. Samuel came in from the barn just as she was setting the table. He paused at the doorway, watching her for a long moment, his hat in his hand. "You didn't need to," he said finally. Clara looked up, meeting his steady gaze. "I wanted to. A house feels more like a home when meals are shared." Something softened in his eyes, though he didn't smile. He simply nodded and sat, bowing his head briefly before eating. Mary's eyes lit up at the warm biscuits, and she whispered a shy thank you that made Clara's heart swell. From that day, Clara slipped naturally into the rhythm of ranch life. She mended shirts worn thin at the elbows, scrubbed floors dusted from boots, and taught both girls little songs as they shelled beans or swept the porch. Emily grew stronger with each passing day, her cheeks filling with color now that she had regular meals and rest. Mary, too, blossomed under Clara's gentle attention. Where once she had been reserved and quiet, she began following Clara from room to room, chattering softly, asking questions about cooking or sewing. Samuel watched all of this in his silent way. He rose before dawn, worked until dusk, and returned each night with the weariness of a man who carried the land on his shoulders. But Clara noticed small things: how he lingered a little longer at the supper table now, listening as the girls shared their day, or how his eyes followed Emily when she laughed, as though he was glad to see her recovering. He rarely spoke of feelings, but his presence itself was a kind of steady reassurance. Clara, for her part, struggled at times with her place. She was not Samuel's wife nor truly mistress of his home, yet each day she found herself moving through the house with greater ease, as though the walls accepted her, as though the hearth was waiting for her hand to tend its fire. At night, when she lay awake beside Emily, she wondered if she was growing too comfortable. What if this was only temporary? What if Samuel one day decided he'd done enough and she must move on? The thought chilled her more than the night air. Still, There were moments when her fears eased. One evening, as she folded laundry by the fire, Samuel returned from the barn. He paused to watch her, his eyes lingering on the neat piles she had made. "House hasn't looked this tended in a long while," he said quietly. His words were plain, but Clara heard the weight behind them. It was as close to gratitude as a man like him knew how to offer. She looked up, her voice soft. "It's the least I can do after your kindness." His gaze met hers, steady and unflinching. "It's not kindness," he said simply. "It's right." Clara turned back to the shirts in her lap, her heart unsteady. Slowly, piece by piece, they were learning each other's ways, not through grand gestures, but in the steady rhythm of daily life. The widow and the rancher were still strangers in some respects, but under one roof with 2 children binding them, a fragile thread of belonging had begun to take root. The change began quietly, almost unnoticed. It was in the way Mary's laughter returned, bubbling out during small moments, when Clara taught her how to braid a length of twine into a doll's belt, or when Emily shared a silly rhyme she remembered from before her father passed. At first, Mary's giggles were hesitant, as though she had forgotten how to let joy escape her chest. But soon, the sound grew freer, brighter, filling the ranch house with a warmth that had long been absent. For Samuel, the difference was striking. He had grown so used to the silence of his home, the kind that pressed against the walls after his wife's death, that hearing his daughter chatter and laugh again was almost startling. He found himself pausing in the doorway after long hours in the fields, simply to listen. Clara didn't notice him watching, and perhaps that was best. For Samuel, it was enough to see Mary looking at Clara with wide, trusting eyes, as though she had always belonged in their lives. Clara, for her part, never tried to replace Mary's mother. She spoke of her gently, reminding the girl of the love she had once known. "Your mama must have been a fine woman," she said one evening as Mary helped her peel potatoes. Mary's eyes filled with tears at the memory, but Clara pulled her into her lap, whispering, "She would be proud of you, proud of the way you help your papa, proud of your sweet heart." The words comforted Mary, not by erasing her grief, but by honoring it. It was Emily, in her childlike innocence, who unknowingly sealed the bond between them. One afternoon, as the girls played on the porch, Emily stumbled and scraped her knee. She cried out, and Clara rushed to her side, gently cleaning the wound. Mary knelt beside them, eyes wide, watching Clara's careful touch, the soothing words she spoke, the way she kissed Emily's forehead to calm her. Later that night, when Clara tucked both girls into bed, Mary whispered timidly, "Mama used to do that, too." Clara's heart ached at the confession, but she only smoothed Mary's hair and said softly, "Then I'll do my best to take care of you, just the way she would want." Mary nodded, curling close, and for the first time since her mother's passing, she allowed herself to lean fully into another woman's embrace. A week later, the moment came that neither Clara nor Samuel expected. Clara was humming softly as she washed dishes, Emily playing nearby. Mary slipped into the room, her rag doll in hand, and tugged at Clara's skirt. "Mama," she said simply, her voice quiet but sure. The word struck Clara like a bell in her chest. She froze, the dish slipping slightly in her hands. Slowly she knelt, meeting Mary's gaze. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her throat tight, "I'm not your real mama." Mary shook her head stubbornly. "But you are. You take care of me. You sing to me. You make the house feel warm again. Papa smiles when you're here." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, spilling before she could stop them. She gathered Mary into her arms, holding her close. "If you want to call me that, I'd be honored," she murmured. Samuel stood in the doorway, unseen until then. He had heard it all, the small, certain declaration and Clara's tender acceptance. For a man of silence, it was a moment that nearly undid him. His throat tightened, his hands flexing uselessly at his sides. He wanted to step forward, to speak, to tell Clara what her presence meant not only to Mary but to him as well. Yet the words caught in his chest, too heavy to release. Instead, he turned back toward the night, his heart both aching and swelling. Mary had found her mother again, not in the woman she had lost, but in the one who had come to them when they needed her most. And Samuel knew, with a certainty as steady as the land beneath his boots, that Clara was no longer just a guest in his home. She was becoming part of his family piece by piece without even realizing it. For weeks, the ranch settled into a rhythm that almost felt natural, as though Clara and Emily had always been part of it. Meals were shared, chores divided, laughter drifted from the porch in the evenings, and even Samuel seemed less burdened, though he remained as quiet as ever. Yet, as often happens in small towns, peace was fragile, easily shaken by whispers carried on the wind. It began on one of Clara's trips into town. She needed fabric and a few supplies, and Samuel had sent her with his wagon, trusting her to manage on her own. Clara was proud of that trust. It felt like proof that she belonged. But as she stepped into the general store, she noticed two women standing by the counter, their voices lowered yet sharp enough to be heard. Already living under his roof. One murmured, "Doesn't waste time, does she?" The other gave a snort. "Poor man, can't even grieve his wife proper before some widow makes herself at home." Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high as she gathered her things. The storekeeper's polite but thin smile only confirmed that the gossip had spread further than she realized. She left quickly, her steps brisk, her heart pounding. That evening, as she stirred a pot of stew in Samuel's kitchen, her thoughts churned louder than the simmering broth. Was that what people believed? That she had come to trap Samuel, to use him as a way to survive? She glanced toward Emily, playing happily with Mary on the floor, and a pang of guilt struck her. Had she truly taken this path only for her daughter, or had she, somewhere in her heart, begun to long for this home and the man who had offered it? The doubts grew heavier over the following days. She noticed the way townsfolk looked at her when she passed, their eyes measuring, their whispers curling just out of earshot. Some smiles were kind, but others carried judgment. Clara began to question every step she took in Samuel's house. Was she overstepping when she mended his shirts? Did she presume too much when she planted herbs in the small patch near the porch? One night, as she tucked Emily into bed, Clara lingered by the window, gazing at the moonlit fields. Her daughter slept soundly, her cheeks rosy from health and laughter, but Clara's heart felt heavy. "What if they're right?" she whispered to herself. "What if I'm only here because I needed shelter? What if Samuel thinks the same?" She did not realize Samuel stood in the hallway, his shadow long against the floor. He had seen the quiet worry growing in her eyes these past days, but hadn't known the cause. He turned away before she could see him, retreating to the porch to wrestle with his own thoughts. Samuel knew the townsfolk talked. They always had. They had whispered when his wife died, speculating how a man like him would manage. They whispered now because people feared change, feared a story they couldn't control. He didn't care much for their words, but he hadn't yet found a way to tell Clara that their judgments held no weight with him. Clara, meanwhile, resolved to step back. She became more cautious, letting Samuel take the lead in decisions, holding herself slightly apart. Where once she had moved through the house as though it were hers to tend, she now second-guessed her place. She convinced herself that she was only temporary, a caretaker, until Samuel no longer needed her. The thought carved an ache into her chest, deeper than she cared to admit. Yet even in her doubt, the bond with Mary only grew stronger. The child clung to her with innocent devotion, and Emily thrived in the safety of the ranch. Clara could not deny the truth. Her heart was already entangled here, no matter what others thought. The shadows of her past, her poverty, her loss, the cruel whispers of others, pressed hard against her. But she did not yet know that Samuel, quiet and steady, was carrying his own determination to speak what he had long held silent. The storm of gossip would not decide their fate. What would matter was what lay between them, waiting to be spoken aloud. The air carried the crisp bite of autumn, the kind that promised winter was close at hand. Samuel had been working longer hours in the fields, preparing for the season, while Clara kept the hearth warm and the children busy indoors. Outwardly, life at the ranch continued as it had for weeks, but beneath the steady rhythm, a tension grew, a silence that weighed heavier with each passing day. Clara still smiled, still cooked meals, still sang softly while sewing. But Samuel noticed the way her eyes lingered too long on the horizon, or how she pulled her hands back quickly when they brushed against his while passing dishes at the table. Something was troubling her. He saw it in the guarded way she carried herself, and he hated that he hadn't yet found the words to ease it. That evening, after supper, Clara began clearing the table. Samuel remained seated, his large hands resting on the wood, calloused and scarred from years of work. He watched her moving quietly, her figure lit by the fire's glow. Emily and Mary had gone upstairs, their giggles still faintly drifting down, leaving the house wrapped in a hushed stillness. "Clara," Samuel said at last, his voice low, carrying more weight than usual. She paused, glancing back at him, a plate still in her hand. "Yes?" He took a slow breath. Samuel was not a man accustomed to sharing his heart. His words usually served purpose, about fences, about weather, about stock. Feelings were harder. But he knew that if he stayed silent now, the wall between them would only grow taller. "You've been different lately." His eyes held hers, steady and searching. "Like you're here but already readying to leave?" Clara's throat tightened. She set the plate down carefully and folded her hands. "People talk, Samuel. You must have heard it too. That I've taken advantage of your kindness. That I've made myself too comfortable here." Her voice cracked, though she fought to keep it even. "I don't want to be a burden or a scandal for you." Samuel leaned back, his jaw tightening. He had expected something of this sort, but hearing the worry in her voice stirred an ache deep in him. He stood slowly and moved closer, the floorboards creaking under his boots. When he stopped by the fire, he kept his gaze on the flames, gathering his thoughts. "I don't care what the town says," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. Never did, truth be told. "They've been talking about me since the day my wife died. How a man like me'd manage alone. How Mary'd turn out without her mama. Folks always got something to say." He turned then, his eyes dark but steady on hers. "What I care about is what's in this house. What's happening here?" Clara swallowed hard, her heart pounding. She had not expected such directness. Samuel's gaze softened, and he took a step closer. "I asked you to come because I saw a woman fighting for her little girl the same way I've been fighting for mine." "You think I opened my door out of pity?" He shook his head. "No, I opened it because I hoped you might bring back life to this place. For Mary and—" His voice faltered, but he forced the words out. "For me, too." Silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Clara felt her breath catch, her heart torn between fear and the warmth rising inside her. Samuel lowered his voice, almost a whisper now. "I don't need charity, Clara, and I don't see you as charity either. I see you as someone this house and my heart has been needing for a long time." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She had longed for reassurance, but she had not expected such raw honesty from him. For a moment she couldn't speak, afraid her voice would betray her trembling heart. At last she whispered, "Samuel." He lifted a hand, hesitating before letting it fall gently to her shoulder, his touch warm, grounding. "I don't ask for promises tonight. Just don't carry the weight of others' words. What we're building here, what you are to Mary, what you're becoming to me, that's what's true." For the first time since her husband's death, Clara felt something shift inside her. The fear that had clung to her loosened its grip. Samuel's confession was not poetry, but it was honest, and it was enough. She nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks, and for the first time, Samuel allowed himself the faintest smile. The fire crackled brighter, as if bearing witness to the quiet confession that had changed the course of both their lives. The days after Samuel's quiet confession passed with a new kind of stillness, but not the heavy, uncertain kind that had hung over Clara before. It was the kind of stillness that came when words too big to ignore lingered in the air, waiting for an answer. Samuel had spoken his heart, simply, plainly, without flourish, and Clara had heard every word echoing in her chest. She moved about the ranch as usual, tending to meals, sewing, teaching Emily her letters, and watching Mary and Emily play in the yard. But inside, her mind spun in restless circles. Samuel's words had opened a door she wasn't sure she had the courage to step through. At night, she lay awake, listening to the creak of the old ranch house and the wind whispering against the shutters. She thought of her past, the years with her late husband, the loneliness after he was gone, the endless struggle to keep Emily fed, clothed, and safe. Every decision she had made since then had been for her daughter's survival, never for herself, and yet Samuel's voice haunted her. What you are to Mary, what you're becoming to me, that's what's true. The truth was, Clara had begun to care for him in ways she hadn't dared admit. It wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't just the relief of shelter or the kindness he'd shown. It was the steadiness of him, the way his silence wasn't emptiness but strength, the way his rough hands carried both labor and tenderness. She had come here a desperate widow, but she was no longer the same woman who had stepped across his threshold that first night. Still, doubt clawed at her. Could she risk her heart again? Could she bind her life to his, knowing that loss was always a possibility, that trust could be broken? Her late husband's abandonment before his death still lingered as a wound. She had given herself once before, only to be left struggling alone. One afternoon, Clara found herself in the barn, sweeping stray hay into neat piles. The smell of leather and dust filled the air, and the rhythmic creak of the rafters above reminded her how time seemed slower here. Samuel entered quietly, his presence filling the space before his voice did. "You've been thinking," he said simply. Clara set the broom aside, her hands tightening around the handle before letting go. "I have," she admitted. "You asked me not to carry the weight of others' words. And I've been trying." She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "But it's not only the town's whispers I hear, it's my own doubts, my own fears." Samuel stepped closer, his boots crunching softly against the hay-strewn floor. "I know fear," he said. "I've carried it since the day I buried my wife. I was scared I'd never be enough for Mary, scared I'd live out my years in silence with nothing but work and sorrow for company. But you came, and the fear didn't vanish, Clara. It just changed. Now I'm afraid of losing what we've started." His honesty struck her like a bell, clear and undeniable. Clara's breath trembled, but for the first time she felt her fear lighten. It wasn't just hers. He carried it too, and perhaps that was the answer. Fear wasn't something to erase, but something to share. "I came here for Emily," Clara said softly, "to give her a roof, to keep her safe. But somewhere along the way, this place became more than a roof. It became a home, for her, for me." Samuel's eyes, usually guarded, softened as if he had been waiting for those words. Clara stepped closer, close enough that the hay dust brushed against her skirt with each breath. "I can't promise I won't be afraid, but I can promise I'll stay. For Mary, for Emily, and for you." Samuel's jaw tightened, as though he were holding back a wave of emotion. Slowly, carefully, he reached for her hand. His grip was warm, firm, steady, the touch of a man who didn't offer lightly, but who would hold on once he did. Clara's choice was not shouted or grand, but it was firm. She chose this house, this man, this life, not because she needed shelter, not because of survival, but because her heart had finally found where it belonged. The barn, with its beams of golden light streaming through the cracks, seemed to hold its breath as if bearing witness. And when Samuel's hand closed around hers, Clara felt, for the first time in years, that the future might hold not just survival, but joy. Winter arrived quietly on the plains, soft at first, then firm, with frosts coating the fences and the cattle's breath rising in clouds against the dawn. Life at the ranch slowed into a different rhythm. Fires kept burning day and night. The pantry was stocked with Clara's careful planning, and the children bundled in wool shawls as they played in the snow. But the biggest change wasn't in the season. It was in the house itself. Clara's choice had settled something deep in both her and Samuel. She was no longer a guest or a temporary caretaker. She moved through the home as though she belonged, because she did. Samuel, in his quiet way, made it clear each day. He didn't shower her with fancy words, but he built her world in steady acts, mending the loose hinge on her door, carving a small wooden horse for Emily, letting his evenings stretch longer at the table just to sit in her company. And Clara, in return, gave the ranch what it had lacked for years: warmth. She filled the house with the smell of fresh bread, with laughter as she taught Emily and Mary to sew crooked stitches on scraps of cloth, with the hum of songs by the fire at night. What had once been a house marked by loss began to feel like a true home. The children, more than anyone, flourished in this new life. Emily, once timid and quiet from years of uncertainty, now laughed freely, chasing Mary through the yard with ribbons trailing behind her. And Mary, who had carried the loneliness of growing up without a mother, clung to Clara with unshakable trust. Their bond was natural, easy, like threads weaving into one fabric. The girls were not just playmates. They were becoming sisters. Still, the town whispered. Some claimed Clara had secured herself a husband too quickly, others that Samuel had been foolish to bring another woman under his roof. But the more they talked, the less it seemed to matter. The ranch stood solid, its gates closed to gossip. Inside, Samuel and Clara had built something stronger than rumor. One evening, as snow drifted outside, Clara sat by the fire darning a sock while Samuel whittled by the hearth. The children had fallen asleep upstairs, their soft breaths carrying through the quiet. Clara glanced at Samuel, his broad frame bent slightly over his work, the firelight tracing lines of strength and wear across his face. "I never thought I'd find this again," she said softly, almost to herself. He looked up, his dark eyes steady on her. "Find what?" She smiled faintly, a tear glinting though she didn't try to hide it. "Peace, a place that feels like mine." Samuel set down the wood and knife, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees. "It's ours now, not just mine, not just yours. Ours." The simplicity of his words struck her more than any grand declaration could have. For the first time in years, she believed she had not just a shelter, but a future. That night, Samuel reached for her hand across the space between them. Clara took it without hesitation. Their fingers intertwined, not as a bargain, not as a necessity, but as a promise freely chosen. The fire crackled warmly, casting its glow across their joined hands. Upstairs, Emily and Mary slept safe and sound, their lives tied together by the bond their parents had forged. Outside, winter howled across the plains, cold and sharp. But inside the ranch house, there was warmth enough to carry them through every season ahead. And so the widow who had once come to the ranch, seeking only a roof, found something far greater. She found a home, a family, and a love that did not demand, but offered freely. The ranch no longer felt like Samuel's alone. It was theirs, a new beginning, not born of pity or survival, but of choice, trust, and love.